In this video, I'm going to explain how I pre-grade my Pokemon cards before sending them to either CGC or PSA. First thing to understand is cards are graded on 4 qualities: the centering, edges, corners, and surface. I'm going to explain each of these categories today, provide examples of what I'm talking about, and then use the information that we learned to pre-grade a couple of cards just to show you guys my process in pre-grading before sending off to these grading companies. Let's jump into the first one, and probably the easiest one, centering. For this category, I have 2 different examples here to show you kind of the differences in centering and what you're looking for to determine whether or not you want to send a card in or whether or not you think a card could maybe hit a 9 or an 8 just based off its centering. Our first example is this Mew. The most obvious example that I could probably show you guys is that this card is obviously very off-centered left to right. When we're talking about centering, we're talking about these borders up here and how equidistant they are to the actual artwork. But you want it to be as equidistant as possible to make sure that the grade's not being impacted by the category of centering. You can see on the back, same thing. I always think about back centering a little bit different than front centering. I think they're a little bit more lenient on the back centering because it's really not what you're looking at when you're looking at a trading card, Pokemon card, sports card, anything like that. So this in particular, very obvious left to right, the centering issues. Now this card, for instance, may be a little less obvious, the centering issues. You can see that the top and the right are a little bit thicker than the bottom and the left. This is a different style of card, so the borders are a little bit different, maybe not as obvious, but I would hope that a card like this would still fall within kind of that 60-40 centering parameter that PSA has. There are tools that you can buy, card centering tools. I don't use one personally. I feel like I've got a decent eye for centering, and to be honest, the grader is only spending probably 30 seconds, a minute tops on each of your cards. So the more time that you're spending with a jeweler's loupe or with a centering tool, the more you're actually looking at it more than the grader's actually going to look at the card to determine the grade. So cards like this, they might be negatively impacted. It might get a 9 instead of a 10, all else amazing, because it's slightly off in centering. But I think obviously this card has a much better chance of getting a 10, all else amazing, than this card that is completely off center. Well, lastly, we'll show you one that's pretty perfect centering in my opinion. We have this other Charizard. Both of these cards actually come out of the same deck, but this one ended up with nicer centering. You can see left to right is pretty equal, top to bottom is pretty equal. This is the type of card that you're looking for when you're purchasing cards. You want something that is equidistant, like I said, on every side around the artwork. That is going to produce the best result in terms of centering is if you find a card like this. The second category, and again, I think one of the easier categories, is the corners and the edges, because mainly what you're going to be looking for is whitening, which is damage to either the front or the back of the card. This particular card, we're going to take a look at the back of the Charizard Level X, because the back has some whitening issues. Sometimes whitening can be really tough to see, especially on new back Japanese. So a lot of times when I'm buying cards from Bai, the pictures may look really good, and then when I get them in, there's whitening all over the edges and corners because it's a little tougher to see on this particular border than it is on an English border, because the English borders are so much darker that any spots of whitening are really going to be kind of amplified in a photo, whereas these are a lot lighter, so it's a lot harder to see some of the whitening around the edges. And honestly, sometimes that can go to your benefit. I definitely had a lot of cards get PSA 10 in my last submission where if you look at them closely, there's a lot of whitening on them, but somehow they still got the 10 because I think it's harder to see on new back Japanese. As you can see here that there's quite a bit of whitening on the edge there. There's quite a bit of whitening on the edge there. Quite a bit of whitening there. I mean, there's whitening basically all the way around the card. Definitely a lot of chewed up, whiteningness here. So a card that has whitening on all 4 edges and possibly all 4 corners, like the most you're probably hoping for is like a 7 or 8. I would not expect this card to get a 9 just because of that whitening and the fact that there's so much of it. Now, I did send a couple of cards to CGC recently that had like a little white dot on the corner or a little white dot on 2 of the corners, and they still got a 9. And I think even with PSA, you could probably have a dot on, 1 or 2 corners and still get a 9. But if you're talking significant whitening on multiple edges and corners, like this card has, you're probably at most looking at an 8, and you might even get less than that because of all of that whitening. Now, you might get lucky, like I said, on new back Japanese. Sometimes those things get missed because graders are not spending a lot of time looking at these cards. They are trying to get through as many cards as possible in a day. So a lot of times they might only be looking at a card for 30 seconds. It's possible that some of these imperfections can get missed, especially on new back Japanese, but like I said, English, where it's a lot more prominent, is going to get hit probably a lot harder because it's much easier to see those issues. Now, corners are very similar to edges. What you're basically looking for, sometimes corners can be kind of pushed in on some cards, like Topps cards, for instance, that are, they call them soft corners. So because they are squared off and they're not rounded, you can have kind of a corner that is a little pushed in, considered soft. Where it's not a sharp edge, it's a little more rounded because of just, wear and tear over time, going in and out of sleeves and stuff like that can kind of soften a corner. Now, most Pokemon cards have the rounded corners, so a lot of times you can still be looking for a little bit of push in on corners or some sort of like little indentations, but a lot of the times, especially on Pokemon, you're going to be looking for whitening or white dots on corners. So, for instance, here, you can see obviously that's going to get hit pretty hard for having that significant of a chip of whitening on a corner. And you see here we have another one. A lot of times on these cards coming straight out of packs, they can have these little like white factory dots. And I think that's just from them being cut. And then when they're removed from the cut, these little white dots can remain. I think they're just extra pieces of the card. I don't think it's damage. I think it's mostly factory, like little pieces on the corners. It really depends on the grader you get, whether or not someone's going to look at that as a factory issue and whether or not someone's going to look at that as damage. Some cards can get 10s with factory marks, and some cards get 9s and 8s and stuff with factory marks. It really depends, like I said, on the grader. Grading is subjective to a certain extent, so you can never confidently say what grade a card is going to get. You can only do your best to kind of estimate. And I think Dan Ketchum Collectibles says, plus or minus 1. And I think that's a good way of doing it. So if you're looking at these cards and you come to a conclusion in your mind, like, you know what, I think this could get a 9, you should always be expecting plus or minus 1. So depending on the grader you get, maybe he had a really good meal last night. He went out to his steakhouse. It was his birthday or something. And he's on, all that serotonin all-time high when he gets into work in the morning, or he has that really good cup of coffee that he only gets once a week. Maybe he gives you a 10 on a card that has a little factory nicks, or sometimes the grader might be broken up with. Maybe he got, yelled at by the waiter last night and he's having a bad morning, and this might get a 9. It actually does come down to those things because the rubrics for these grading companies are so soft that it really comes down to the discretion of the grader and the subjectivity. For corners, you're definitely more looking at trying to find whitening on corners and factory, little white dots to figure out whether or not your card could possibly still get a 10. Last but not least, and probably most importantly, is surface. Surface is something that can drastically impact the grade that you're going to get from these different companies. So for a long time, PSA, in the past, they've had this reputation where if a card has a dent or a bend or a crease, it automatically got hit with a 6, and then anything else kind of brought that grade down past a 6. We have been seeing that differently. Pokemon Steven has gotten a lot of cards back from PSA that have little dents and little dings and stuff that still get, 7s, 8s, and 9s. I would be wary of surface damage, and that goes for CGC as well. Surface seems to be the thing that they're most scrutinizing of. So this card, for instance, if you look at the corners, if you look at the edges, looks absolutely beautiful, right? And I was so excited when I got this one in, this Charizard deck holo. I really like this one. I've sold one before in a 9. It sold really well. But when you look at it, you can see at the top there that there is a dented line that goes almost all the way across the top of the card. And you can see there another dented line. So most likely what happened here is it was probably in a sleeve with multiple other cards over time, and those cards pushed kind of dented lines into this particular card. So unfortunately, this card has those dents on the back, which is going to significantly impact the grade that it's going to get with any particular grading company. The rest of the card is perfect, and you can see that beautiful swirl there right by his hand. It really pisses me off that this came in this way. Those types of dents are going to be issues when you send in for grading because they are pretty noticeable and they're on multiple different pieces of the card. So I have had some cards that have really slight dents that I send to CGC because maybe they're a little bit more favorable on dents and I can still get like an 8 which overall still a decent grade for some cards, especially based on their value. You can still get decent money for, and that's definitely a play that some people have done, is they buy, you know, PSA 5, 6s that look mint but happen to have a little, you know, minor dent on the back or something, and they send to CGC and they can get 7s and 8s, and they can sell for more, kind of making that play. And a lot of people crack, you know, CGC 9.5s hoping to get PSA 10s to kind of make money in that play. So really figuring out what grading company you want to use for a particular card is important as well, because ultimately you want the card in the slab that's going to give it the higher grade, especially when you're trying to sell and make money doing this. These types of surface issues, these really kind of faint bends, are, again, really tough to see in pictures. So when you're buying stuff off Buy or eBay, those types of things are really hard to see. So you're kind of taking a risk, again, on most of the cards you buy that, you know, when I bought this card, I thought it looked mint. Corners, edges, beautiful, but when it comes in, you can see then that it was stored improperly, and this card has multiple dents across the back, which is going to heavily impact the grade. Now, could I still send this to CGC and maybe get an 8? Possibly. I might try and do that, but ultimately, probably okay to sell raw just because of how much those dents are going to impact things. So lastly, when I am looking at a card to pre-grade, how quickly can I do it, and how efficiently can I scan through these things? Like I said, I mean, you want to be quick. You don't want to use any extra tools or anything, because graders are not going to be using those tools grading your cards. They might use them for cards that are worth like $50,000 or something insane. And no grader's using a jeweler's loop to look at your card. Ultimately, they're not spending that much time on your card. So what you should be doing is you should be scanning for surface issues, looking for whitening, and quickly kind of judging the card and trying to figure out, does this have a chance at a 10? If it has a chance at a 10, how much is it? How much can I sell it for raw? And figuring out whether or not it's worth tying up the time to send it in for grading. So this card, for instance, is exactly what I'm looking for when I buy stuff, and hoping that cards come in looking like this. So as you can see, the centering is pretty decent. Left to right, the right might be a little bit more. Top to bottom, the top might be a little bit more, but I think it's within that 60-40 parameter. On the back, you can see absolutely stunning. There's no whitening whatsoever. Back looks really nice on the edges and everything. And then in terms of surface, I would take a ring light or some sort of light, and I would quickly scan the back just to make sure, because the minute that you shine a light on a card like this is the minute you're going to see a dent. So it's really easy if you just back and forth on the back of the card with a light, just make sure that there are no major dents or fingerprints or pieces of whitening. And if you don't see anything bad, then throw it in a card saver, add it to the stack, you're good to go. So hopefully that was informative to a lot of you guys. Good luck with your pre-grading, and I hope all of your guys' PSA and CGC returns are epic.